Welcome back, Gadgeteers. So for this video, what I decided I would do is talk about my Linux environment and how I use Linux on a day-to-day basis, the applications that I'm using, the things I do in Linux, and why I like it so much. So this video is probably going to be a bit rambling because I'm going to go from area to area in Linux and just kind of give you an idea of what I like about it and how I use it. So if you don't like rambling videos and you don't like Linux, this is probably one you can skip right off the bat. Here's the thing. Linux is just an operating system. It's like any other operating system, and it takes time to get to know it. Now, I've spent, well, 18 years now. I started getting into Linux around the late 90s, 98, 99. As I began to support servers that were running Linux. Back in the day, with the organization I was working for, a big nonprofit, had mostly Windows servers and a Unix server and maybe one Linux server. Now, when I left that organization, they were about 90 to 95% Linux. So all the Unix servers went away. Most of the Windows servers that could go away went away, and everything was replaced by Linux because Linux had come to the point where it could scale really well, and you could do most modern things that were necessary with Linux just like you could with Unix before. That was when I thought that not only do I understand the server, but I really should be working in Linux on a daily basis so I could get to know the workstation as well. So what I did was installed at the time Fedora core on my desktop computer, and I think this was probably around 2005, 2006. I don't really remember anymore, but I changed my desktop over to primarily Linux, and then when I needed, I would use a virtual machine and work in Windows with the virtual machine. So ever since that day, basically every system I've used, whether it's the system I'm on now or a laptop, I've created a dual boot environment and installed Linux. Now, many people don't like Linux because of the fact that you're not necessarily likely to find the help you need to fix things. I just had to fix one thing with Kdenlive and I couldn't find any help on it, so I had to figure it out myself. There was some video editing that I was doing and I was having a problem. Again, I had to fix it myself. I'm using OBS over here to do the recording, and I wanted to do a couple of different tweaks and settings, and of course I had to figure it out on my own because that's just the way it is with Linux. Sometimes you're not going to find the help that you want, although there is a tremendous amount of assistance out there. If you just do a search, usually you can find what you need. I have the impression that many people that I talk to that are simply against the idea of putting Linux on their system don't prefer it because of that learning curve. But in my opinion, the learning curve for Linux is about the same as Windows. It's just that for me, I've been doing it for a longer amount of time. So if you dive into Linux, so to speak, at first the learning curve would be very, very steep, and everything that you do to try to change or fix something will probably be difficult, but eventually over time you would become very good at it. Here's the cool thing: even though the learning curve is really steep, the more time you spend in Linux, the faster you learn it. So if Linux is your go-to, you're going to learn it extremely fast. If you're working in Linux every single day, say like I did at my job 8 hours a day, you're going to accelerate your learning curve and you'll come to be able to do things in Linux and feel comfortable much, much faster. And that's what I've done. So for me, Linux is now my go-to operating system. Looking at the things that have happened recently with Spectre and Meltdown, I'm actually really glad that I did that. There's some tremendous tools that are available in Linux that you can't get in Windows that allow you to do very granular updates. that you can get away with, and you can choose what updates you want to install and when you want to install them. And I think that that is a very good feature of Linux. Case in point, if I cruise over to, let me make this a little bit bigger. Etsy DNF. Let's say, for example, I'm going to open up another terminal here. It's time to do updates. And I'm just going to go ahead and become root over here. Maybe. If I actually know my password. And I'm going to make this screen a little bit larger. Now, if I did DNF update, there's a lot of updates out there right now. Let's have a look. So there's quite a few updates here that are available. Now, what if I wanted to only do a single update like VLC Core or VLC, which would probably install VLC Core at the same time? Well, I'm going to do quit here by saying no, and then I can do a DNF update VLC. Let's see if it does VLC Core as well. Yes, it does. So I could do just that update. Now let's say I find out that VLC Core was causing a problem and I wanted to stay on the version that I was on. So in this instance over here, we just showed how we could do an update to just VLC and ignore all the other packages. But what if I wanted to install all the other packages and ignore only VLC updates? Pretty easy. We actually can go over here and we would edit dnf.conf. And we would add a new line, exclude equal, and we would put in any packages that we want to exclude. For example, VLC, I could put VLC asterisk, and I would exclude all the VLC packages, and I could go ahead and do my updates. And this, if I left it in here, would stop me from installing those particular packages. Now, while I'm here, I could add, for example, kernel star. So just like with Windows, I had some problems with some Spectre updates to the kernel. So I've frozen the kernel that I'm on, and I'm using an older kernel. I've locked the kernel that I want to use. I could, for a little while, freeze updates on the kernels and give things a month, maybe 2 weeks to shake out before I try the latest kernel. And if I wanted to, I could exclude all the kernel updates with kernel star. So I'm not going to save this. So it's very easy to do. The other thing that's cool is you can use a very simple command to do an upgrade from your previous version of Linux to the next version. The other thing that I found is typically when you do an update with Linux from one version to the other, and I'm speaking now about Fedora, so other versions may not have this particular feature or act the same way, but if you use DNF to upgrade your system from one version of Linux to the other, my experience has been there is no slowdown or no problems running in Linux. It's just basically the same thing whether you're on the version previous or the new version. Now, sometimes there's a few bugs, so I usually wait it out a little bit on my main machine before I update to the newer Linux, maybe a week or two. See, the cool thing is when you use the upgrade feature built into DNF, you get all the latest packages that are in the stable release. So instead of downloading the ISO, installing it, and then having to update all the packages, you already get everything that's updated. Now here's an even cooler thing. I had this hard drive, this SSD that I'm using, inside a different computer for, well, 3 years. And then I bought a new computer, and all I did was take the SSD and move it to my new computer, I had to go into the BIOS and make a few changes. I had to tell UEFI to allow legacy boot. Normally it just wants to do UEFI booting. And I was able to boot into Linux. The hardware was redetected on boot up. Everything worked glorious. Now, the one thing I did have to do as far as video goes, I do have in my computer an AMD GPU. It's actually an RX 580 Radeon. So I did have to add some support for that. Now, if you do a DNF list and you do star AMD GPU star, you can actually look here and you can see that there is a package that I already have installed, but this is the open driver that is supported by AMD, and it has worked really well for me. I've played a couple of different games on it and it's doing pretty well. I did buy a couple of new games, so I'm going to do some more testing with it, and then I'm going to install that same game using Steam and test it in Windows and see how it works out. But if you want good driver support, it really is there if you look around. Is it going to be as good as Windows for playing games? No, probably not, but I don't use Linux really for playing games anyway. I do have a few that I play, but for the most part, I'm not gaming. And I know many of you will say, well, I only want it for games, so I don't want Linux for that reason. Well, that's up to you. If that's what you want, I say go for it. If you want to do Windows and you want to play games and that's what you want. I'm more interested in an operating system that has utility, is open and free, that I don't have to pay for, and I feel personally has far better security than Windows does. So I installed this driver right here. It only took a few seconds. I rebooted. Usually video drivers are not going to take effect until you reboot, so go ahead and do a reboot. Okay, let's talk about distros for a minute. I hear often that people say, well, Linux really sucks, and whenever I hear something like that, my first thought is, could you be more specific? What part of Linux sucks? Which distribution were you using? What version was it? What kind of computer were you running it on? Computer I have here, my main computer, is a Dell 5675. It's got the Ryzen 1700 processor in it. It has 16 gigabytes of RAM, 2 SSDs, one each for Windows 10 and one for Linux, and then a 4 terabyte storage drive. So I pretty much have the hardware covered, but what about the distribution? And I'm here to tell you, not all distributions are created equally. There are tons and tons of distributions that come out and they get praise and notoriety probably a little too early before anybody actually has a look at them and does a little bit of more in-depth use with that distribution. Case in point, go and watch Switch to Linux's video on Solus, and he has a couple of videos, and you get an idea of the difference between a well-developed distro with a lot of developers behind it and a distribution that isn't quite so well developed. Now, Fedora is one of the top distributions, just like Ubuntu. If you're interested in using that, those have had a lot of time to be developed. Now, personally, I don't really like the idea of going with Ubuntu because it is a for-profit organization behind it, and I'm kind of concerned about how long support's going to continue. The other thing I try not to do is use distros based on distros. So case in point, if I was going to install Ubuntu, I think I would just install Debian instead, because Ubuntu is based on Debian. Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu, which is based on Debian. So if the Ubuntu line gets wiped out, what then for Linux Mint? Are they just going to base it on Ubuntu, or excuse me, Debian, and do all the work that's required to get Linux Mint back to the point that it already was at? So I'm a little bit leery of going for distros based on distros. I liked it to be a primary distro, and Fedora is one of those. The other thing I hear about Fedora is that it's the experimental arm of Linux, and that is not, well, of Red Hat, and that is partly true. Yes, a lot of the technologies that go into Fedora end up in Red Hat, but we're talking about a stable operating system. This isn't experimental in the sense that they're just throwing code in there and say, let's see what happens. The way the experiment works is to change and develop and update the distribution on a regular basis. Every 6 months we get a new major version release. So although it is mostly evolutionary, many people think that that means that there's this huge experimentation going on and you have buggy code, and that is not the case. It is very reliable, and the version that you're on is supported for up to 2 years, 4 versions back, so you can stay on the older version if you wish. What I have noticed with Fedora, if you choose to stay on the older version of Fedora, the problem is you won't receive any major updates. So LibreOffice released version 6.0. Now, right now, I don't think we have 6.0. Let's look and find out. No, we're still on 5.4. So in order for me to get to LibreOffice 6.0, I've got 2 choices. One, I can install it manually, which means it doesn't get updates through the Fedora update system, or I can wait for Fedora 28 to come out, and then I will get the next major release of LibreOffice. Is that a showstopper? No, not at all. Right now, version 5 is usable. It does all the things I need it to do. It's one of those go-to apps that I use all the time. At some point, I'll probably switch over to 6.0 when I upgrade to Fedora 28, which will work perfect for me. Now, looking at apps that I use, you already can tell that I do use the command line quite a bit. It's not a complete necessity in Linux, but unfortunately you do have to get somewhat familiar with the command line. You can get a Linux for Dummies book to get you started in the basics that you need to know. And there's more advanced books out there, but you know, honestly, one of the basic books works really well and it helps you get started. So up on the desktop here, I've put most of the apps, Steam not included. Steam put its own icon on the desktop that I pretty much use on a regular basis. So you'll notice I have WaterFox instead of Firefox. I've talked about that in a previous video, so do a search in my videos for Firefox or WaterFox and you'll find my discussion. WaterFox is a open source derivative of Firefox. So what's the point? Well, Firefox, of course, it's built with code that, although the Firefox project itself is by a company that is not for profit, that company, Mozilla, is owned by the Mozilla Corporation, which is for profit. So there's some telemetry stuff that's been stripped out of WaterFox, as well as other monitoring things that can go on in here. So I just prefer WaterFox. It's really my favorite browser and the one that I use most. Of course, everybody knows OBS. I've got it running right here, and I really like OBS. It's really, for me, I continue to learn and learn more about it, and I feel like it's probably the best recorder out there. Now, I do not have hardware support enabled. That's something I'm going to have to work on at some point. Let's see. Kdenlive, my other all-time favorite. This editor is actually very, very, very good. The downside with Kdenlive, although you can go in and do anything for the most part that you could do in Adobe Premiere, because that's really what it's modeled after, it is somewhat of a learning curve. And if you're going to be on a Linux distribution, you have to accept the fact that you're going to have to think and develop those skills, those critical thinking skills that you can use to help you figure things out. Case in point, on this video here, installing an SSD in Gavin's laptop, I have 3 layers here. I've got a graphic, I have a picture-in-picture with a filter on it to position and zoom it in the left corner, and then I've got the main video here, which is this one. Well, The problem happened that whenever the video would begin playing and we'd get to the point where the graphic came up, what would happen is this entire segment here would go blank. Now, I looked and looked and looked and looked and looked on the internet, and I couldn't find a single thing for it. So I finally thought, well, there's got to be help somewhere on this. So I looked around here in the software. I couldn't find anything. And finally, I just went into effects. And I know that these two are a composite, so I decided to look up compositing. My apologies, it's actually in transitions. And I found a composite filter transition that I could apply. So I applied it, and it worked perfectly. So now with this composite filter in place, I'm able to play this video and put up the title and have this video here in the background. Now, what if I actually wanted to, say, dissolve into this particular title here on the screen? Well, I could do that. All I have to do is shorten the composite and go back up and drop a dissolve in there. Yes, I can. There we go. And I'm going to make this one, actually I think, yeah, I'll make it a little bit larger. And then I'm going to extend this one to meet it. If I shrink my timeline down again and then I watch it, watch the graphic come up. So first the picture-in-picture comes up, and then we have a dissolve in with the title, although I didn't want that. But you get the point. You have to work in the applications, and you have to develop the skill set, and you know, unfortunately some of that stuff isn't going to be available. Now, one of the things I thought on doing, and I'm hoping I can get Tom's help over in Switch to Linux, is I'm thinking I'm going to start writing a book, a tutorial book on how to use Kdenlive, because I'm developing these skills. I'm not seeing it in Kdenlive's actual documentation, although they do have nice documentation. I would consider what I would write more of an addendum to it. So Tom at Switch to Linux knows how to set up LibreOffice Writer specifically, which is the equivalent of Microsoft Word, to publish books. And my goal is to make the book free and open source so that anybody can use it. Okay, enough of that. But anyway, it's all about working with, I'm going to quit and I'm not going to save that, working with the different applications you're going to use. I tried to use Final Cut Pro for a few minutes, and it actually took me about an hour to figure out how to do a transition. Now, try not to laugh, you Final Cut users. I know you're going to chuckle on that, but see, to me it just isn't intuitive. With transitions in Kdenlive it is, and it's kind of similar, more similar to Premiere, Adobe Premiere. So when I tested Adobe Premiere, and I do have a video on that, I felt really comfortable in it, even though there were some things that it couldn't do for me, okay? It would do it, but it took some work. Anyway, the point being, I would have to learn those skill sets with Final Cut Pro just like I learned with Kdenlive or any other application I use. So it does take time. Another one I really like, of course, is GIMP. Now, many people might say, how could you possibly like GIMP? Well, is it the best one out there? No. But I can do on GIMP what I need to do. Now, you're not seeing the toolbars because I actually have them on my second screen. So the system I'm using has two screens, so I always pull my toolbars over and I put them on this separate screen here. but they're all here. And the reason I do that is it just makes things a little bit easier for me when I'm doing my work. I have all my tools on the other screen, and if I want, I can go really large here when I'm making changes, or if I'm working with the layers or whatever it is I'm doing. And I've actually found GIMP to be reasonable. Now, I am by no means qualified as a photography editor. I did used to be really good with Photoshop, but we're talking about the versions way back, Photoshop 4, 5, and 6. So it's been a long time since I've had to use Photoshop. So GIMP does what I need for me, and I have been able to find quite a bit of support online that talks about GIMP. So if you're more interested in GIMP, you're going to find more support online for that application than you would for some of the other applications. Okay, so that's GIMP. We talked about LibreOffice. I really like LibreOffice. It's probably not as fine-tuned as other offices like Microsoft, but I don't know if you've heard, but version 2019 of Microsoft Office will only run on Windows 10. And I know, many over here are going to say, that's not an issue at all, Mark. Why even making that point? Well, if you wanted to stay on Windows 7, which is still supported, or Windows 8, no, you have no choice. But you could, on the other hand, install LibreOffice on any computer you want, whether it's Mac, Windows, whatever flavor of Windows, and, of course, Linux, and use them cross-platform. So that's a really nice feature. I like to keep my favorites here. This is my list of apps that I use. We talked about the web browser, video editor, GNU, OBS. I have a simple sound recorder that I use here when I'm recording background sounds. So it's not too exciting. If I click record, it'll start recording a clip, and I can just use that clip and drop it into my timeline in Kdenlive, which is nice. I have the word processor we talked about, and the other thing that I use quite frequently is kwrite. So I do a couple of different things with it. One, it's just a lovely text editor. I will basically go through, and when I create a when I create the information that's going to be in my video description, while I'm waiting for the video to render, I'll go through and just compile it and set it up the way I want it. Then I have everything listed. It's ready to go. The minute the video is done rendering, I can upload it. I usually work on the thumbnail too while it's uploading, and I can put this information in, pop the thumbnail in, and I'm ready to go live and click publish right away. So it's a great editor. It's very nice. You can use it for more advanced things like programming if you want. It can do that as well if you have an interest in it. Me personally, I probably would not use it for programming because I don't hardly do any programming. I'm going to close that. I don't really want to save it. So I have File Manager here. And you notice I'm having to drag all of these over from my right screen for the most part. That's where I'm using tools like this. So when I'm editing, I'll have Kdenlive full screen, and I'll keep my tools on my second monitor so that I can see them and not have to switch back and forth. So this is nothing really that much different than Explorer, but I do like the organization. So I've got some places here. I created home. Home isn't there by default because I always like to see a listing of all of my files and folders in home. The other one that I created is a 4 terabyte NTFS drive that I have. And this particular drive here contains backups of FastGadgets. So I've got all of the raw video that I've created, and all of the edited videos that I've created pretty much since the beginning, so everything's in here. I do that for one so I can have it just in case something happens to YouTube. You never really know. And two, I can use the raw footage again if I want to for some filler or eye candy for a computer system, which is really nice. So if I really wanted to find this 4 terabyte drive, I'd have to cruise over, well, you can already see it, /mount, and then 4 terabyte is the name of the folder I created, and then backups is the folder we're in right now. So mounting a drive is pretty easily done. You can use the mount command. However, if you want it to come up every time, you do need to edit etc fs tab. And I've added a line here at the bottom which mounts SDB, which is my second disk drive that's in the system, partition 3, and there's only, well, there are more partitions, but the NTFS partition is the largest one, the location I want to mount it at, and then the type of file system, in this case NTFS, and I just go with the defaults. And the cool thing is I can put anything I want on this particular drive. I have read-write access to it. If I shut down and boot into Windows, I can get access to this again. So all that content there is available and ready to go for me. Okay, the other cool thing that I've set up that I do use quite a lot is called Samba, which is a server program that allows me to offer access to certain directories of content or hard drives on my Linux system to all the other systems in my house, including the TVs, which is really nice because I can watch anything I want just by scanning my network and logging in with the appropriate credentials. So if I go to the command line here and type in smb:// and do a search for this particular Linux system that we're on right now, which is Fedora, all I have to do is press enter, and I have access to the 4 terabyte drive, which is the NTFS drive, via the network, or I can get into my home folder. Now, the home folder you do have to authenticate, and it is read and write, whereas the 4 terabyte drive I've set up as a read-only drive. So anybody can look at this and they can make use of it. And if I wanted to restrict the security even more, I could force them to have to authenticate as a Samba user, which if you watch my video about creating a Samba share and setting it up on your network, you can pretty much create any user you want. You do have to create a Linux user first, then you create the Samba user with pdb edit, the command. So it's not overly complicated, but if somebody, say a friend came to visit, you would have to create a user account on your system, or you could create a generic one and give them the login and password to get it into your read-only share. So that's really useful for me. The other thing I do after I get done backing up, and it's really pretty straightforward, FastGadgets, I just basically copy everything here. All I do to back up my current Linux setup is cruise over to my home directory, grab the Mark folder, and drag that folder over to my 4 terabyte drive, and that gives me a full backup. The next time I go to drag it over, I can update files, or I can skip files that are already there. Now you can write a command line small script if you wanted to, and you could do it that way. Some people use rsync and other tools, so there's all kinds of easy ways. I'm just going for the quickest, easiest, so all I do is grab the Mark folder and drag it over and do a copy that way. The other thing I do with this 4 terabyte drive with my backups is I back them up to a portable drive. So I have a small portable drive here I use that's 512 gigabytes. What I did was take the old hard drives out of any computers that I upgraded with an SSD, and I bought a $10 case for it. This one's from Initech, and all I had to do then was use this drive to make a backup of my backup, which I can take with me if I'm on the road. Or, you know, at least I have a backup. So any important documents I actually save in the cloud, so those particular documents I have a copy of, but videos I don't, because it's just so much storage. If I go into my videos, yeah, so I've got about 429 gigabytes. I'm not going to be buying that much storage in a cloud, and I really wouldn't want to sit around and wait for all that stuff to upload and download. It'd be totally painful, totally not doable. So really, my cloud storage for my edited videos is YouTube, if you want to think of it that way. But it works really well for me, and it makes things easier for me having that backup and knowing I have a backup of a backup. Any current stuff I'm working on, of course, is in the SSD. So anything I've been doing here lately is in RAW or is going to be worked on soon. Anything that's been edited lately hangs around in here, and then eventually I will move them to the 4 terabyte drive as well. I usually wait 4 or 5 versions. Now I've got some experimentation I was doing here, and these ones I can just get rid of. I can add them to trash or I can delete them. I've been doing move to trash, and these ones as well. And later I'll empty trash, you know, usually after maybe 2 weeks or a month, just in case I have to go cruise over there and get it. But if I'm running low on storage, so if you look here, the one we want to watch out for is Fedora Home. So I've only got 19 gigs available. I'm using 136 gigabytes, so it's getting close to time for me to probably clear some stuff out. It's not just here. We can also check and find out how big my home directory is. So if I go back here and look in properties, it's probably where most of it is. Yeah, 135 gigabytes. So pretty much all of it. Why is that? Well, I got a lot of stuff in here. I've got downloads I have to contend with. I have some music, although not too much. I do have the videos here. I have some audio recordings. Now in Kdenlive, I have done some proxying of 4K clips. So I got to figure out where those proxies are. Probably zap those, get rid of those. We can go into Kdenlive and do a properties. Really not much going on there. I know in downloads I've got some stuff I've got to get rid of. But, oh, I know what it is. Well, one of them anyway is my Windows 10 virtual machine, which is taking up 60 gigabytes. The thing about VMs, of course, is that things slowly but eventually, gradually, especially with Windows and a virtual machine, expand. So it really does, over time, take up a lot more of your storage. And I did try moving it to my 4 terabyte drive, this Windows 10 virtual machine, and it was horrific. It basically acted just like a Windows 10 computer that's on a standard hard drive, which is not doable. It's just not. I don't know how many of you are doing it, but there's certain things like Windows updates or game loads that are just sheer torture. Now, having this on the VM, I absolutely love it. It's really quite fast. Whenever I do virtual machine experimentation, I like it to be on the virtual or on the SSD because it's much faster. There we go. It wasn't scaling. Now, this one I believe I updated to the latest. I know we're supposed to be talking about Linux, but even though I have Windows here, I do use Linux to run it and support it. So my favorite app for that is VirtualBox. I'm not sure what you enjoy, but it works really well for me. So I updated this one. I'm running version 1703. I wish there was a way to shrink that virtual hard drive that I have. Let's find out how much real storage I'm using on this system. So it's really 44 gigabytes, yet the virtual drive is, as you saw, about 60 gigabytes. Now my SSD is not really that big, so it's chewing up a considerable chunk of my 250 gigabyte SSD. For my system, the actual physical system, I thought about buying an M2 SATA. The Dell 5675 computer that I'm using does have a larger SSD, it has an M2.SATA slot, so I could get a larger SSD and put in that slot. It's less expensive to get one of the standard SATA drives, SSD versions, so I might do that. I would really like to go up to 1 terabyte, but I don't think I'm going to have the money to do that. I do have other virtual machines, but those ones are hanging out in my 4 terabyte. So I can run any of these, and when I run it, it will be added automatically. Whoops, wrong one. Oh, no. Yeah, sorry. So this is automatically added to the menu. Let's see how fast it loads compared to Windows. So this is Kubuntu, or Kubuntu, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I always like experimenting with my virtual machines before I actually put it on actual hardware, because you know that you're going to find so many different problems. And quite frankly, if it won't run in a virtual machine environment, I just don't think it's going to work. I'm trying to remember if this is one. Nope, I didn't blow this up. So this one's working well still. But you can see with a standard hard drive, it does take a little bit longer to load. So what other apps do I enjoy using? Well, many of these apps that I'm using, I'm actually using in Windows and Windows and Mac as well. So VLC Media Player, for example, Oracle, VirtualBox, LibreOffice, OBS, WaterFox. All of these I'm using whatever platform I'm on, Windows, Linux, Mac. GovCView, I don't know how you actually pronounce it. This is a great app. Now I've got the camera running right now, and these are not my actual camera settings, but what I do like is I can create profiles, then I can load those profiles and set the camera the way I want it, which is really quite cool. And I frequently do that, and I'll go back and forth between different profiles depending on what I have my lights in the studio set for. Of course, you can record with this and everything else. You can capture video, you can do an image. I haven't really gotten into all the different things that you can do. It's usually on image controls by default, and then I'll just go ahead and adjust all of these for my C920 Logitech camera. If you have the saturation all the way up, it's really a big mess. So it's just simpler to do all these adjustments and then create that profile, and then you can just load the profile whenever you want. Great tool. I love Rhythmbox. It's so simple. It's got some things built in that kind of remind me of using iTunes, maybe like the older iTunes, but there's podcast here. You can add the podcast you want. There's radio already here. There's not a whole ton of them, but there are some. Like House is really good. I enjoyed that one. I don't have a Last.fm or Libre FM account. Libre I might have a look at, but I do not have a Last.fm account. And, you know, I've got music on here. Now, the funny thing is, I really haven't added all my music. I have quite a bit of music on the 4 terabyte drive, several gigabytes. When you add it in, I want to make sure the system's going to be up for a while, so I'll just plop that folder in and I can add it to here so I can see literally all of my music. What I have here right now, these ones that you're seeing, most of these are actually the YouTube Creative Commons music that you can download and you can use. And there's quite a bit. But I really do like Rhythmbox. You can rate music and it'll show you recently played, recently added, top rated. So when I add back in all that music from the 4 terabyte drive and I hear a song and I'll say, I know I just heard it maybe 5 or 10 minutes ago, I can go back and look at recently played and get a look at whatever music I played. Now what's strange is I did play some. I don't know if that's per open. Let's find out. Let's start this one playing. And go to recently played. Okay, let's do this. Let's play another one. Then let's go to recently played. I'm not sure why that's not showing up. How about view all? Nope. Playlist? Nah. Recently added? Yeah, this one I was using in a video I recently did. Not sure what the deal is with recently played. I'll have to do some testing and figure that out. But I do really like Rhythmbox. It does work pretty well for me and does what I need it to do. Oh, what else do I use? So there's many apps that aren't in my favorites that I really don't use all that much, but there's just a ton of things. Utilities is a good example. If you don't like looking at the logs in the command line, they actually have a log viewer now. So first they show important, and of course you can see all. You can look at applications, specifically system related, any security, and finally hardware, which this would be useful for me if I'm looking back trying to find out what happened with the reboots and issues I was having, although it was pretty easily remedied by simply switching to a different kernel. I do have DOSBox. I forgot all about that. I'm going to add that to favorites. And if I go back to applications, I can actually grab that and copy up here. Now you'll notice that it has this exclamation point triangle on it. What you have to do is launch it, and it wants to know if you want to trust it because you're launching it from your desktop. And there's DOSBox. Now I set DOSBox so that the screen would double in size when it automatically comes up because it's so hard to read. So let's see what happens if I type exit. It's gone. I only have one game that I was working on for my wife on there, but I do plan on putting in more games. Actually, I think I do have more than one now that I say that. Whoops. Did I set up a C drive? Yes, I did. Yeah, I only have one game. Oh, I was doing Star Trek. That's right. But anyway, I'll do a little bit on DOSBox in the future, but not many people seem very interested in it. There was a couple of games that I wanted to put into DOSBox. Oh, let's see. What else do we have? In internet, you've got quite a few different things. At some point will probably set up RSS feeds. I haven't done it yet. I have different browsers that I use. I don't use the mail client. I just do webmail. Steam is in internet. What an odd choice. I think I would have probably put it in games. I did install recently Witcher 2. I actually Witcher 1, 2, and 3. Only Witcher 2 right now is compatible with Linux, so I'm going to start doing some experimenting, and I'll do a video in the future on Witcher 2 and how well it runs in both Windows and Linux and do some comparisons. The only one that I've used so far is Left 4 Dead. I did a few things in Witcher. I played it for about 10 or 15 minutes in Linux, and it was doing well, although the frame rate was lower than I was thinking it should be, so I'm going to have to look into that. I hate having to do this over and over. Instead of doing that, what I usually do to shut a system down is use power off. So you can just power off, or you can do reboot, or you can use the shutdown command. But if you simply type power off, no matter what the state of your system, down it goes, and immediately. So even if you have documents open or anything, it doesn't matter. It's going down immediately. I can hear my hard drive chuckling down there, which I think is kind of funny. I'm definitely going to have to look into getting a larger SSD. I think we get really spoiled with SSDs. They're so wonderful. They're so fast. I don't know if this thing's still shutting down or what it's doing. I'm just going to leave it there. We're going to see what happens. But overall, hopefully you see now what my Linux setup is and why I use Linux and why I enjoy it so much. Everything works really, really well, and it does exactly what I need it to do. So personally, I can't see using Windows. I only use Windows to support what I do at my job as a teacher, because I am training students on Windows 10 and Microsoft Office 2016, and in the future 2019, even though personally I don't really agree with that. Now, the school I work at, they do teach Linux and open source as well. It just depends on what degree you're doing. But the whole thing with Windows 10 and Office is it's a basic computer class that every student has to take. So that is what they're exposed to. Most of my students, they're used to their smartphone, and that's what they know. And that's a little bit scary. I wish I could infuse other things into it. I do bring my MacBook and I show them what a different operating system looks like. I project it up on the screen. I suppose I could do that with Linux, but you can see it in their eyes. Some of these students, their minds are blown when I show them a Mac. I have students come in and they just go out and they buy a brand new Mac because they think that's what they're supposed to do. And they come in and they say, Mr. Evans, I don't know how to do anything on this computer. I can't find anything. I don't understand what I'm doing. So what I'll do is say, go ahead and bring your Mac in, and while I work and I show everybody everything on the screen, if you sit near me with your Mac, I'll show you quickly how to do it and help you as much as I can. And at least they get some idea of how to do things on the Mac, or while I'm doing a tutorial, I can just say, do it this way on the PC, and I can show them, and I'll say, by the way, on the Mac, you need to go to this menu or whatever, Finder, so on and so forth. Anyway, that's my Linux setup. The system works great. Physically, the hardware is wonderful. The operating system, up until the Spectre issue, I wasn't having any crashes, and that scared me for a bit, but when I went back to that older kernel, everything was fine. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe, and if you really liked it, share, and if you really, really liked it, drop by my patreon.com/FastGadgets page and consider buying me a cup of coffee for $1. I always appreciate your support, and I want to be able to expand what I'm doing and continue offering videos on Linux, Mac, and sometimes on Windows, but not much. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets.